Something does not quite fit inside the standard image of early Homo sapiens. For decades, the public received a carefully simplified picture of our species, a thin and gracile tropical lineage emerging somewhere in a tropical region around 300,000 years ago, before suddenly spreading outward across Eurasia, roughly 50,000 years ago. In that framework, Europe and Central Asia belonged to Neanderthals, while modern humans existed largely in isolation farther south, until a dramatic late expansion changed everything. Yet buried inside the genomes of eastern Neanderthals and inside the anatomy of early Eurasian skeletons, there exists another signal entirely, one that points toward an older, physically powerful and geographically widespread branch of Homo sapiens already moving across Central Eurasia more than 200,000 years ago, and probably even earlier. The deeper the evidence is examined, the more difficult it becomes to defend the older image of gracile tropical newcomers suddenly replacing archaic northern populations. Instead, a different pattern begins to emerge, one involving robust human groups, Levallois technology spreading across Western Asia around 250,000 years ago, and repeated encounters between early Homo sapiens and eastern Neanderthals during warm climatic intervals that opened vast migration corridors from the Middle East into the heart of Eurasia. The turning point arrived when researchers studying the genome of the Altai Neanderthal discovered unmistakable ancestry from an early Homo sapiens lineage buried deep inside the Siberian Neanderthal genome. This was not the famous later interbreeding event tied to living Eurasians around 50,000 years ago. The direction ran the opposite way. Early Homo sapiens mixed into eastern Neanderthals long before the standard dogma allows. The genetic study identified unusual modern human haplotypes within the Altai Neanderthal genome, with many of those segments tracing backward between 100,000 and 230,000 years. The study openly stated that this ancestry entered the eastern Neanderthal lineage far earlier than previously imagined, and that the source population represented a deeply diverged branch of Homo sapiens. What makes this discovery so striking is that the signal appears strongly inside the Altai Neanderthal, yet barely appears inside Western European Neanderthals, such as Vindija or El Cidron. This means the event belonged to a much older eastern interaction zone, stretching across Central Eurasia, rather than a late Western encounter. The timing matters enormously because the climatic conditions around 230,000 years ago transformed Eurasia into a very different world. During the warmer intervals tied to marine isotope stage 7, enormous corridors opened across the Levant, northern Arabia, the Iranian plateau, and the grasslands extending towards Central Asia. Areas later crushed beneath Ice Age cold became rich grazing environments filled with large mammals, permanent water systems, and expanding human populations. Human movement during warm phases followed these ecological belts naturally. Once those corridors opened, populations from the Middle East could spread astonishing distances across Eurasia within relatively short spans of time. This creates a direct connection with another idea increasingly discussed in genetics and archaeology, especially by David Reich and others examining the expansion of Levallois technology during the Middle Pleistocene. Around 250,000 years ago, a dramatic technological shift spread across Western Asia, the Levant, and large portions of Eurasia. Levallois stoneworking suddenly appeared across enormous geographic distances with a level of sophistication that implied organized planning, standardized flake production, and advanced cognitive behavior. The spread happened too broadly and too rapidly to represent isolated invention. Instead, it points toward expanding populations carrying a shared technological system outward from a central zone, probably linked to the Middle East and nearby territories. Reich discussed the possibility that major human population movements accompanied these technological expansions, creating interconnected lineages spreading through Eurasia long before we were told. Once this idea is placed beside the Altai Neanderthal genetic evidence, something remarkable appears. The chronology aligns almost perfectly. A robust Homo sapiens lineage connected to Levallois expansion around 250,000 years ago fits directly into the later genetic signal inside eastern Neanderthals. These populations did not remain trapped. waiting for a late exodus. They already occupied portions of Southwest Asia and probably central Eurasia during warm climatic intervals. As eastern Neanderthals expanded eastward through the same territories, contact became inevitable. The Altai Neanderthal genome preserved the memory of those encounters. In effect, the genetic evidence supports the idea that an early Levallois carrying Homo sapiens lineage spread northward and eastward from the Middle East during favorable climates and eventually mixed with eastern Neanderthal populations somewhere along the Great Corridor extending toward Siberia. Then, another overlooked detail appears, one that fundamentally changes the physical image of these early Homo sapiens populations. The older stereotype portrays early modern humans as slender and lightly built tropical people fundamentally different from Neanderthals. Yet the skeletal evidence says something entirely different. Many early Homo sapiens fossils display extraordinary robusticity. The skulls from Skul, Kafza, and early Europeans like Meladek and Oasa possess thick brow ridges, broad faces, heavy muscle attachments, and long, low cranial forms. Some of these skeletons overlap strongly with archaic Eurasian populations in physical structure. They do not resemble the gracile urban humans familiar today. Instead, they resemble Ice Age hunters shaped by physically brutal environments. This becomes even more important once the Siberian robusticity study is considered. Researchers examining hand phalanges from Neanderthals and Upper Paleolithic Homo sapiens discovered that several early Homo sapiens individuals possessed astonishingly thick cortical bone structure, in some cases even exceeding Neanderthals. The study specifically concluded that hyper-robust skeletal traits existed among both Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, and proposed that the extreme robusticity of Altai Neanderthals could represent a legacy inherited from early anatomically modern humans. That conclusion changes everything. Rather than imagining gracile tropical Homo sapiens diluting archaic northern anatomy, the evidence instead points toward a powerful northern Homo sapiens lineage contributing directly to the physical structure of eastern Neanderthals. The details inside the skeletal material become increasingly difficult to ignore. The Kostenki 14 individual from Eastern Europe displayed extraordinary internal bone thickness. Sungir individuals also carried powerful hand structure tied to intense biomechanical stress. The Altai Neanderthals themselves displayed enormous variation, with some individuals hyper-robust, while others appeared more gracile. This diversity strongly suggests long periods of mixture between different human groups, rather than isolated evolution inside a frozen Siberian refuge. The robusticity study even noted at least 2 morphological variants among Altai Neanderthals. Such diversity fits naturally within a model involving repeated interactions between Neanderthals, Denisovans, and robust Homo sapiens populations moving through central Eurasia during warm climatic windows. Something else begins to emerge once these findings are assembled together carefully. The distinction between modern and archaic starts to dissolve. The older framework depended heavily upon sharp boundaries separating Homo sapiens from Neanderthals. Yet the anatomy, genetics, and archaeology increasingly point toward overlapping populations interacting repeatedly across enormous spans of time. Early Homo sapiens carried robust skeletons, powerful hands, thick cranial structure, and advanced Levallois technology. Eastern Neanderthals carried ancestry from those populations. Denisovans mixed with Neanderthals repeatedly. By the time the later migration around 50,000 years ago occurred, Eurasia already possessed a deep history of interconnected human groups. The Central Eurasian setting becomes critically important here because it overturns another old assumption. Eurasia was often portrayed as a peripheral theatre where archaic populations stagnated while innovation occurred elsewhere. Yet the evidence increasingly points towards Central Eurasia and the Middle East as major engines of human interaction and development. Levallois technology spread outward from this region around 250,000 years ago. Robust Homo sapiens populations expanded through the same ecological corridors. Eastern Neanderthals acquired ancestry from these groups. Later, modern human expansions moved across many of the same territories once again. Far from being isolated or marginal, the Middle East and Central Eurasia formed a giant interaction zone where multiple human populations crossed paths repeatedly for hundreds of thousands of years. The climatic context strengthens this interpretation even further. During colder intervals, populations fragmented into refugia, scattered across the Levant, southern Europe, Arabia, and parts of Central Asia. During warm phases, those isolated groups expanded outward and collided once more. Marine isotope stage 7 around 240,000 to 190,000 years ago created exactly the type of ecological opening capable of driving such movement. Grasslands expanded northward, river systems stabilized, animal herds spread across enormous distances, human populations followed naturally. A Homo sapiens lineage, tied to Levallois expansion, moving through these corridors around 250,000 years ago, fits perfectly into the later Altai Neanderthal genetic signal, tracing backward toward 230,000 years. Then the deeper implication appears. If a Homo sapiens population already occupied Central Eurasia during this period, then the narrative becomes far more complicated than usually presented. The traditional framework depends heavily upon the idea that modern humans stayed biologically confined until a relatively recent dispersal around 50,000 years ago. Yet the Altai evidence proves that a deeply diverged Homo sapiens lineage existed in Central Eurasia early enough to contribute ancestry to Eastern Neanderthals long before that later migration. This means the expansion of Homo sapiens into Eurasia began far earlier and involved multiple waves, multiple refugia, and multiple interacting populations rather than a single clean exodus. Even the physical image of the first Homo sapiens must change. These were not delicate tropical wanderers suddenly conquering cold northern territory through superior cognition alone. They were robust Ice Age humans adapted for physically demanding conditions. Their skeletons carried thick cortical bone. Their hands showed enormous stress adaptation tied to tool-making and hunting. Their faces still retained many archaic characteristics. In some regions, they probably looked remarkably similar to neighboring Neanderthal groups. The boundary separating them existed more inside later classification systems than inside the actual living populations themselves. And perhaps this explains why the Altai Neanderthal evidence feels so unsettling. It exposes a hidden chapter of human history that does not fit neatly into the simplified narrative repeated for decades. A robust Homo sapiens lineage carrying advanced Levallois technology spread outward from the Middle East around 250,000 years ago during favorable climatic conditions. Those populations moved into Central Eurasia and eventually encountered Eastern Neanderthals. The encounters became intimate enough to leave genetic traces buried inside the Altai genome more than 120,000 years ago, and probably closer to 230,000 years ago. The skeletal evidence suggests these Homo sapiens populations already possessed the physical strength and robust anatomy often associated exclusively with Neanderthals. Instead of two sharply divided worlds, there existed a vast interconnected human landscape stretching from the Levant into Siberia. The farther this evidence is followed, the more the older image of human origins begins to dissolve. Human evolution no longer resembles a clean, branching tree with isolated species waiting neatly in different continents. It resembles a tangled network of migrating populations repeatedly mixing, fragmenting and spreading outward during favorable climates. The Altai Neanderthal genome preserved one fragment of that forgotten history. The robust bones of early Homo sapiens preserved another. Levallois technology spreading across Eurasia preserved another still. Once those pieces are placed together carefully, a far older and more complicated human story begins to emerge from beneath the ice and stone of Eurasia. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this journey into the forgotten intersections between early Homo sapiens Levallois expansion and the eastern Neanderthals of Siberia, be sure to subscribe and join us again as we continue exploring the buried clues hidden inside ancient genomes, powerful Ice Age skeletons, and the overlooked chapters of human origins that still refuse to disappear.